Okay. So, hi everybody. Welcome to the Phillips Manor Hall, the latest installment of the Phillips Manor Hall lecture series, sponsored by the Friends of the Phillips Manor Hall and also Tompkins Bank. Your speaker this evening is going to be J. Keith Doherty, me. J. Keith Doherty is a Westchester County native. Should I speak in the third person? All right. I'm a Westchester County native. I grew up along the Old Croton Aqueduct, and I was a professor of art history for 12 years at Boston University. And in recent years, I have been researching the structure and architecture of early Westchester and New York City. And tonight I'm going to be talking about the Old Croton Aqueduct. Well, not exactly the Old Croton Aqueduct, but aqueduct building in any case in a rural Manhattan between about 1835 and 95. We don't think of Manhattan as a rural place, but in the period that we'll be talking about tonight, that is precisely what it was, at least the northern three quarters of it. So I want to thank, before I begin, Laura Compagni, also Joanna Reisman, my colleagues here at Phillips Manor Hall who have been putting up with me, my angst about this for the last week, and Margaret Oppenheimer, and all of the people in Manhattan that helped me. So, in any case, this is the second of a two-part series that many of you online, and the people in the room, may have attended the first installment that deal with the impact of the building of the Croton Aqueduct, which was New York City's first abundant and reliable water supply, built between 1835 and 42. The impact that it had on the hundreds of landowners that found themselves in its 41-mile path, reaching all the way from the Croton River Valley in northern Westchester all the way to the heart of Manhattan. And last time we focused on Westchester, the area above where the water comes from, where we found that residents and landowners were victimized, displaced, even killed during the building process, especially in the area of the Croton River Valley. And though they were paid for their land, they were forced to sell their property via an early quasi-legal exercise in eminent domain. They typically did not receive much, and most entered into the transactions unwillingly. In addition to the demolition of innumerable homes and outbuildings, the conduit ate up acres of arable land and blocked key roadways and waterways. We also found, however, that landowners discovered many ways to mitigate the damage and even to turn the situation to their advantage through negotiation, legislation, litigation, and so on. We even saw that they were able to have a converse impact on the architecture of the aqueduct itself. Hence, many of the most celebrated features of the Old Croton Aqueduct, like the bridge in Ossining or the High Bridge, which connects the aqueduct, connects the Bronx and Manhattan, came about specifically because of landowner intervention. Landowners who would not allow waterways to be blocked by the building of the aqueduct. We also saw that landowners were able to actually affect the route of the aqueduct. The planned route of the aqueduct was altered on multiple occasions so that it would not go through important buildings and other things that landowners were trying to protect. So landowners had all of these means of mitigating the damage, impacting the situation. So today, we are going to give the same treatment to Manhattan. It's the so-called fourth and final division of the aqueduct, the last 7 miles or so before it reached its destination, two reservoirs that we'll look at it in a minute. And as we're going to see, many of the same conflicts that played out in Westchester also are very much present in Manhattan, in spite of the fact that it was meant to be the beneficiary of this whole thing. And that's because most of Manhattan in 1836 was still rural. Okay, it's hard to get our minds around that, but believe it or not, the city pretty much stopped at like Canal Street in the 1830s, or if you want to be generous, Houston Street. The rest of it was rural, and I'm showing you a map from 1828. This entire area up here is basically developed only with farms or estates okay, on the two rivers. The reason that it has that grid all over it is because the street grid had already been planned, but none of those streets are actually there yet. Okay, the street grid has been planned for Manhattan, but not yet executed. The fact is that in 1836, all of this is pretty much looks like this. Okay, lovely, grand houses on the rivers and some farms. The introduction of the aqueduct into this idyllic, manicured world was met with much horror. As one resident of the Bloomingdale neighborhood along 10th Avenue put it, the aqueduct may be said to be the first disturbance of our area by the march of public improvement. Indeed, infrastructurally speaking, it was the hinge between rural Manhattan of the colonial period and the urban Manhattan of the industrial period. When the OCA was built in Manhattan, there were two main features. Most of you guys, I'm sure, know this very well, but for those who may not, I'll just go through it. Along with the line itself, there were two enormous reservoirs, one of which was located in today's Central Park, called the Receiving Reservoir, and a second one located where the New York Public Library main branch is now on 42nd Street. So the first one, you can see it here, the Receiving Reservoir in what is now Central Park, looked like that back in the day. Here's a photograph of it when it was being demolished in the 1930s. And here is what it became, the Great Lawn in Central Park, the dimensions of which are completely dictated by that of the reservoir underneath it. The second reservoir was on 42nd Street. It looked like this. Today, it has become the New York Public Library. From that second distributing reservoir, it was channeled into a vast network of a vast distribution network, okay, that was ran under most of the streets downtown in lower Manhattan at regular intervals. And it was installed in stages, and we'll get into that a little bit later. One thing I do want to stress before I begin, and Laura is actually the one that prompted me to do this, is that whereas the Old Croton Aqueduct in Westchester was kind of completed in 1842, it was never completed in Manhattan. The Old Croton Aqueduct was really like an ongoing, more or less continuous process. And so within 7 years or so of the completion of the Old Croton Aqueduct, you see the city trying to supplement it, trying to complement it, trying to enhance it by different means. And so as early as 1850, only 7 years after the completion of the Old Croton Aqueduct, they're already building a second reservoir in Central Park next to the first one. We call this second reservoir the Jackie Onassis Reservoir. At the time, it was called the Great Reservoir. And in the High Bridge, which connects the Bronx and Manhattan, as I said, they installed a brand new pipe that was 3 times the width of the previous one. And this was all done in the 1850s. So the building process was ongoing in Manhattan. Ultimately, it would culminate with the building of 3 brand new aqueducts. The New Croton Aqueduct, which went up in around 1890 and followed the same line as the old, and then eventually you had the Catskill Aqueduct and the Delaware lines in Ulster County, all of these feeding Manhattan. But in Manhattan, the process of building never really stopped. So, I just want to say, I know I sound like I'm being critical of the builders of the aqueduct, but I really admire, I must say, I really admire them tremendously. I think it was like an unbelievable feat. They did something that was unprecedented in its scale, and they did it in like 7 years, and it was 41 miles long, and they ran it through the Hudson Valley, which is about as hostile a topography to aqueduct building as you could possibly imagine. It was an enormous feat, and it It delivered water to a Manhattan that had literally been dying for it for like a century. Things were terrible in the 1830s. There had been several cholera outbreaks spread by contaminated well water, along with the single most destructive fire in the city's history, which is the 1835 blaze. All of this had just happened, and it was due to a lack of water, a lack of good water. After the introduction of the Croton supply, these problems diminished greatly. The population exploded, tripling in a mere 20 years, mostly because of that new water. This, in turn, created the need for all of this supplementary construction, and ultimately, 3 brand new aqueducts. Together, the aqueducts solved the water problem and set the stage for the largest metropolis in the USA. Okay, so I'm not trying to overstate the importance of the aqueduct, but there would be no New York City without the aqueducts. It's a gravity-fed system. It's basically the same technology that they used in ancient Rome. Okay, the whole thing is built so that it's a very, very slight incline. It drops less than 13 inches per mile, and that incline must be maintained at all times. You can't go lower, you can't go higher, unless you do some special tricks, but we'll talk about that in a second. So it's gravity powered. It's the same technology as ancient Rome. And most people, when they're riding or walking on top of it in Westchester, have got no idea that there's an enormous 7-foot by 4-foot pipe under their feet when they're walking. But even though there's obvious clues like this ventilator all over the place. So the trick with aqueduct building is basically to follow the high ground. The channel cannot be disrupted. The angle of the channel cannot be disrupted, and typically the aqueduct is very highly elevated, right, because it has to reach an elevated target, and so you have to follow the high ground so that the topography supports it, and you don't have to build it up. And so you want to avoid any kind of depression, any kind of waterway, because when you hit a waterway, you've got to build a bridge or some kind of massive structure to support it to maintain the incline. This was expensive and the kind of thing that needs to be avoided. All right, I just go over all that because it's all going to come into play right now. OCA remnants in Manhattan. There aren't any, pretty much, okay? If you're looking for the remnants of the Old Croton Aqueduct in Manhattan, you're going to be kind of disappointed. There is a segment of the northern retaining wall of the original reservoir. Okay, it's on the 86th Street transverse through Central Park. You know, there's a couple of transverse roadways through the park. If you go through one of them, you will see this. It belongs to the original reservoir. The rest of it was dismantled in the 30s and turned into the Great Lawn. If you go up these stairs, you can see the top of the wall. There's also the High Bridge, which is original, and it's the oldest bridge in New York City. But that's about it, except for a couple of manhole covers. The best way to see the Old Croton Aqueduct in Manhattan is to look for the secondary evidence of it, its footprint, okay? There's lots of stuff like this. The aqueduct is running like this through 153rd and 152nd Street, and so you've got lots of diagonally shaped buildings all over the place so that they can avoid the aqueduct running past. So if you look, I think the astronomers have some trick where they, you know, if they see a star twinkling or something, it tells them that there's another star in front of it or something like that. You know, you can read it from the negative imprint. And that's how you can see it for the most part. The dimensions of the Great Lawn, the dimensions of the New York Public Library, they're all determined by the Old Croton Aqueduct. There's also remnants of the later buildings. So you'll see a lot of these. These are gatehouses along 10th Avenue, but they belong to the new Croton Aqueduct. This tower, which looks familiar probably to a lot of New Yorkers, if you've ever been stuck in traffic on the Deegan, okay, you can get a nice look at this thing. It's the High Bridge Water Tower. It's part of the so-called high service works. But again, these are part of later projects. Okay, there were two factors, okay, that led to landowner and builder conflicts in Manhattan. And the first one was Manhattan itself. The landscape is absolutely outrageous. The original landscape of Manhattan is absolutely outrageous. It's just a series of swamps alternating with crags or outcroppings, basically. It's extremely, extremely chaotic, lunar. I'm showing you a picture of Fort Tryon Park. If you've ever walked on the Dyckman Avenue side of Fort Tryon Park, you can see just how dramatically the outcroppings come up. This is a picture of 84th Street in 1857, and this kind of extremely irregular surface is really, really, really typical. It's about the worst place to build an aqueduct, even worse than Westchester. The second really, really difficult, complicating factor was the grid, the street grid, okay, which was being built at the same time as the aqueduct. And the street grid is sort of exactly the opposite of what the aqueduct needs to be, right? The topography is so random and so, undulating that any aqueduct builder in Manhattan would have to pursue this circuitous serpentine path in order to adhere to the high ground. The street grid is completely straight and linear. It's sort of the most hubristic thing that I think human beings could do to Manhattan, is try to impose a waffle iron on it. Manhattan has been so manipulated that we tend to think of it as this like flat landscape. It was anything but. And so when Jervis encountered it, he saw this kind of lunar landscape, and then he saw the street grid. And the street grid had been conceived, say, 20 years before the aqueduct. And the city planners, when Jervis was going to build his aqueduct, told him, you cannot interfere with any potential development within the city blocks. And so we want you to build exclusively underneath the future avenues of our street grid. Okay, so Jervis was told that he had to build his aqueduct on 10th Avenue in a straight line all the way down to 86th Street and then make a hard left and go toward the reservoir. This is like a completely impossible thing. Whoever made this request of Jervis knew absolutely nothing about engineering or aqueduct building, absolutely nothing. So Jervis actually received this news with characteristic equanimity. He's kind of an amazing man. Nothing really threw him too much. He sort of said, yes, sure, I'll build it that way. But he knew in his heart of hearts he was not going to do that. And so in time, he negotiated a kind of meandering route where he still followed the avenues, but he jumped between 3 different avenues in such a way that he could continue to follow the high ground. Okay? If he had done what the city asked, he would have had to have built an embankment or a culvert that was nearly a mile long, unbelievably expensive and time-consuming. And so he negotiated, as he always did, and got this route instead. So you can see the difference in this topographical map between the planned route and the one that he negotiated. Nevertheless, okay, the fact that he had to stick to the avenues meant that there was going to be all sorts of valleys, ups, and downs that he was going to have to deal with. Even though he negotiated that modified route, there was still going to be lots of ups and downs. And so the roads that got built on top of his aqueduct were almost always either well below grade or way above it. Some of the roads that got built on top of Jervis's aqueduct were 40 feet off the ground, 60 feet off the ground. And so pretty soon, like about 30 years after he was done, they sent all of those things underground, but the ruins of these roads that had to be built on top of his aqueduct stuck around for a really long time. And so we have these pictures from around 1900 and illustrations from like 1890 that show these massive ruins. And these are raised roadways that Jervis had to build on top of his aqueduct. It's a pretty messy situation. And it created, especially on 10th Avenue, it created a continuous wall that ran along the entire west side of Upper Manhattan. John Punnett Peters, who was a pastor at one of the churches on 10th, said, the Upper West Side was torn up by the construction of the Croton Aqueduct. The line of the aqueduct cut through many of the old country places. The first disturbance by the march of public improvement, it constituted at most parts of its course an impassable barrier, traversed only at rare intervals by roads and staircases. So, moving geographically, I want to start at the top of Manhattan, talk about their progress through Manhattan with that backdrop in mind. I know I've thrown a lot at you already. But the first serious obstacle that the builders encountered was directly on the Manhattan side of the High Bridge. And her name was Eliza Jumel. Eliza Jumel lived on a 36-acre estate, the centerpiece of which was the Morris Jumel Mansion, which if you haven't been there, you've got to go. I know a couple of people who work there are watching me right now, so I'm going to plug the MJM. And so she bought that house and the estate from, it had originally been built by the Revolutionary War loyalists, Roger Morris and Mary Phillips. Eliza Jumel is quite simply, I think, one of the most fascinating individuals in 19th century New York. She was born, into the most meager of circumstances, raised in a brothel and orphanages, and loaned out by those orphanages as a domestic servant. She learned at a really young age that she could depend only on herself to survive and get ahead. And get ahead she did. Despite her gender and her origins, she managed through a series of highly unorthodox stratagems involving a wealthy husband and some tricky legal maneuvering to become quite wealthy and to launch herself into Manhattan's elite. She was, in short, the consummate New Yorker. All right. Here is her property when the aqueduct went through. This is hard to read, but trust me, this is the Harlem River right here. Here's the aqueduct coming over it from the Bronx via the High Bridge and moving across her property in this long strip that ran the length of the property. At the same time, she's got the street grid attacking her on the west. Okay, here's the house. So she's getting wedged in from both sides. She's besieged. She brought, so where am I? Her revenge for all of this was swift. Well aware that they had little choice but to land the High Bridge on her property, she leverages this fact and got the water commissioners to give her the single highest payment of any property owner on the entire line, and there were hundreds and hundreds of them. She received about $11,000, about $400,000 today. She also attempted a similar coup when it came to a second water-related project on her land some 20 years later. I'm speaking about the High Service Works, okay, which was a reservoir on the hill above her home near the High Bridge. Okay, and a reservoir of this kind was gonna be built eventually. It had to be built in the vicinity of Jumel's mansion because it was the highest point on the Harlem River. So if you were gonna supply the northernmost part of Manhattan, there had to be a reservoir somewhere near Jumel's. And consequently, something of the kind was discussed very early on by DeWitt Clinton Jr., who was the very first person to propose a route for the Croton Aqueduct. He suggested a reservoir here. Later it was brought up again by David Bates Douglas, who was the first chief engineer. They discussed it again in 1851, but it did not come to fruition until 1865, the year of Eliza Jumel's death. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think she held it up. You might say, I mean, you could say that, the technology was a barrier. Definitely, what was being done here was new at the time. Okay, in the first place, they had to get the water up the hillside from the high bridge to the water tower. And this involves something called an inverted siphon. Okay, we're getting a little technical right now, but an inverted siphon is basically a narrow iron tube. It's much more narrow than the conduit itself, so that when all of the water from the conduit hits it, the narrowness creates pressure, and you can literally fire the water uphill. There's a saying, I think, that no river, runs uphill or something. It's not true. It's not true. If you have an inverted siphon, the river can run uphill, okay? And so that's what they did here in order to get it to the water tower. The purpose of the water tower was to compensate for the pressure that was lost sending it uphill and to create more pressure. What it did, and this is crazy, but what the water tower did is suck, thousands of gallons of water into itself. It pumped the water up to the top of the tower by a steam engine-powered machine, pumped the water up to the top of the tower into a huge chamber at the top, which then tilted it and dumped it down the other side of the tower. And what that did was create a lot of pressure, so that when it entered this reservoir here, it was fully pressurized, and it could shoot out of the reservoir and go into 3-story buildings all over the neighborhood if you want. Okay, so that technology was kind of new. Perhaps that held it up, but I think Eliza was a big part of it. She actually wrote a letter in 1864 to the Water Commission in which she offered to perform her own assessment of her land so that they would know what to pay her for the land when they bought it. And she did it on the pretense of doing the city a favor. She said, I would like to do this to avoid the expenses which a city would necessarily have to incur for it to ascertain the value of my property. How nice of her. What a nice lady. That is a lot of hogwash. So what she did was she broke the 7 acres or so that they needed into urban lots, because she figured the whole thing was going to become urban, so it would be filled with small lots of about 2,500 feet. She said, each one of the lots would go for about $650. Well, there's about 120 lots in 7 acres, and at $650 a pop, it comes out to like $79,000, which is like $3 million today. Needless to say, the city did not avail itself of her services. They paid her eventually about $45,000, which is not bad. You're still almost at $2 million in today's dollars. A view intercept. Another aristocrat, that took great exception to the project was one John Bradhurst. He was a lawyer and a land speculator, and he lived in a lordly residence that he called Pinehurst, which lay at the future intersection of 147th and 9th in the prestigious Bloomingdale neighborhood in what is now, I believe, Morningside Heights, or I think Washington Heights. It's in Washington Heights. His neighbors, there's his house, there's his portrait. His neighbors were Eliza Jumel, Eliza Jumel to the north, Eliza Hamilton, and briefly Alexander Hamilton, who lived at Hamilton Grange, just south. Hamilton Grange still survives. Alexander did not live here very long. He was killed by Aaron Burr shortly after they bought this house. And to the west of Bradhurst was John James Audubon, the famed naturalist. Okay, so this was a pretty Tony neighborhood that Bradhurst was in. And he did not appreciate the aqueduct going through the middle of his land. He wrote, "Gentlemen, I understand that you have determined to carry the aqueduct through my farm by way of the 10th Avenue," which this is a new thing, the 10th Avenue, "and to raise a barrier of earth immediately to the rear of my mansion of several feet in height, intercepting the view. injurious in other respects, interfering with improvements that have cost me large sums, I ceded that 10th Avenue to the corporation, meaning the city, for the purpose of an avenue under particular circumstances. I've been informed by the street commissioner that if used for that purpose alone, no permanent filling would be required. In other words, he sold this tract of land to the city to be a street, not to be a 10-foot-high embankment. He's affronted. His view of the Hudson is intercepted. Okay, so he fought, and ultimately he won a lawsuit. He won about $6,000 in a lawsuit. Another thing that's interesting about Bradhurst is that the house survived for some time, and in photographs, the aqueduct actually gets lower and lower. I think he may have succeeded actually in getting the city to bring the aqueduct down. But again, I'm still researching a lot of this stuff. Many of my conclusions at this point are still a little raw. Oh yes, and there he is. Okay, you can see the aqueduct was intercepting his view. Okay, so there were lots of valleys. Even though Jervis was sticking to the avenues, plenty of valleys in Manhattan. If you've ever been up and down Manhattan Valley, okay, the bottom of which is 125th Street. If you ever drive on 10th Avenue, it's a big bowl, okay? In fact, it's the most dramatic up and down that you're going to see in Manhattan. Probably 10th Avenue in that vicinity would have been brought down, because that's what they did in the late 19th century when they were building the streets. They tended to bring them down, even in the Upper West Side. They didn't do that with 10th Avenue. Why? They brought down Convent Avenue, just that they brought down, why didn't they bring 10th Avenue down? Why is it so steep? Because the aqueduct is under there. So we talk about how the aqueduct shaped the city today. The whole city plan, okay, the Upper West Side and Harlem and places like that, the height of 10th Avenue, it's all because of the aqueduct. In any case, there were two major valleys. There's the Manhattan Valley, and Jervis handled this by using a siphon, a very long siphon. Again, this inverted siphon is a narrow iron tube. And then there was a second valley, a little further down, called the Clendenning Valley that I want to talk about briefly. By the time Jervis got to 9th Avenue, he decided he had had enough. He was not going to build his aqueduct under the street anymore. So he adopted a bifurcated approach. So he decided to build the aqueduct beside 9th Avenue, not below it. And because it was a valley, he created this very long, what he called a culvert. You could call it an embankment or even an arcade, because it was pierced at intervals by arches. And what those arches are intended to do is admit the side streets through it. And this actually was kind of a battle. The Water Commission did not want to create any openings in this culvert at all, even though it was 7 blocks long. And the mayor at the time, Isaac Varian, had to step in and say, you must create apertures to allow for the cross streets. But they only did it with half of it, so 100, 99, and 98. 97, 96, 95 were sealed off. Today, and there's Clendenning's house. He was actually an Irishman, which is very unusual, and he got wealthy importing Irish textiles. And his house was doomed anyway. Here it is. Okay, it was in 9th Avenue. So if you were living in rural Manhattan, you were going to get nailed by something. Okay, either the grid or the aqueduct. So Clendenning, even though the aqueduct avoided 9th Avenue, was still going to get nailed by the street grid. Wasn't a good time to. So the Clendenning arcade was taken down, just like all of those other elevated roadways I talked about before. And around 1860, 1870, and it was reused to build the church. So if you ever find yourself at 60th and 9th Avenue looking at this church, you're looking at the reused Clendenning Valley Arcade. Okay, moving on to Central Park. So I'm going to read my notes for this one. Okay. So as the OCA approached, or as the aqueduct approached the receiving reservoir in today's Central Park, it came along 85th Street, which sent it directly through the heart of something called Seneca Village. Seneca, if you're not familiar, was Manhattan's very first substantial community of free black landowners. Coalescing around 1830, it continued in various forms until 1855, when it was finally wiped out with the building of Central Park. It's evidence, it's an amazing thing. It's evidence of a nascent black middle class in the city in the direct aftermath of slavery. Slavery wasn't really outlawed until 1827, and here we have 1836, a community of free black landowners in the future Central Park. The village was located on the western edge of what became the park, mostly between 86th and 84th. And the final stretch of the aqueduct ran along the 85th Street axis right here, right through the heart of the village. The massive receiving reservoir was right there as well. And these things, apparently the reservoir did not impact the village, but the conduit running along 85th Street eliminated about a third of it. Okay, well, this is what it looks like now. Here's the reservoir, or what was the reservoir. It's the Great Lawn. And here is what was Seneca Village. It's actually quite hilly and elevated. Terrible farmland. But most black farmers, if they could afford the land, had to buy farmland that was not ideal. And that was the case at Seneca Village. So while most are aware of the elimination of the village by the park, few know of the damage done by the OCA. 85th Street was pretty much doomed by its elevation. It was the perfect little carriage for an aqueduct. Okay, it was at the perfect height, and I'm showing you a section drawing that John Jervis made of the area, or a profile drawing. This corresponds to 90 through 85th Street. This represents Seneca Village, and here is the reservoir over here. So you can see that the pipe ran just underground through it. And there's been a lot of disagreement on the part of archaeologists and historians about just how the pipe went through Seneca Village. If they just looked at the aqueduct records, they would know. It's right here. Okay, this tells us how it goes through. So archaeologists so far have not excavated that part of the village, although they have excavated several other parts. And this is the only map that I'm aware of of Seneca Village that actually predates the OCA. So here it is. Okay, it looks pretty humble. Here's 85th Street. Here's 86th, 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue. So this is the location of the future reservoir. This dates to about 1838. As you can see, a number of homes would have been taken out by the conduit on 85th. There were probably several more homes than we see here. We have a census from 1840 for Seneca Village, and it lists like 20 households, not the 12 that you see here. So there were probably many more. They were just so small, the mapmaker decided, why bother? Okay? So all of those folks would have been knocked out. And we know that 85th was pretty much knocked out, because if you look at later plans, like this 1851 map, you see a bunch of structures on 85th that were built, we know, all after the aqueduct. So this Episcopal church here dates to about 1849. This house here, the Reservoir Keeper's house, also dates to about 1849. So like 6 and 7 years after the aqueduct. So this is all, This is all new development here, as opposed to 84th Street, which looks exactly the same as it did before the aqueduct. In any case, in addition to all those homes, they also probably disturbed lots of graves. The original purpose of Seneca Village, at least the way that the founders of the village envisioned it, is that it would serve as a cemetery, not as a residential space at all. And so there were lots of burials in Seneca Village, mostly along 85th Street. And there are records of people being buried here as early as 1827, so nearly 10 years before the aqueduct came through. And we have named individuals from like 1836. So all of these people would have been exhumed and moved elsewhere. And there was a second cemetery in the village. Okay. Not too long after the first reservoir was built, the second reservoir was built, the Jackie Onassis Reservoir, which would have knocked out all of these homes. These are the condemnation maps made for this reservoir, and you can see there's several more domiciles in the area that it took up. So all of these homes would have been eliminated as well. So when we talk about the end of Seneca Village, by the time Central Park was built, it had already been damaged quite a bit by the aqueduct building. So moving right along, am I going too fast? No? The people online can't say anything. Maybe they'll send a chat to John or something. And, so moving right along, the distributing reservoir is like my favorite part of the aqueduct. I just think it's cool. It sits, like I said, the site is now occupied by the New York Public Library's Schwartzman building or the main building, but it looked awesome. It's one of the very, very few elements on the aqueduct that was designed by a professional architect, who I'll talk about in a moment. And here it is. It held about 20 million gallons, which is about a fifth of what the receiving reservoir held. Its purpose seems to have been to not hold water so much as generate pressure. Okay, by the time the water got from Central Park and 86th all the way down to 42nd, it had lost a lot of momentum due to friction and use of siphons and so on. When they pumped it into this reservoir, 20 million gallons builds up, creates a lot of pressure. Okay, so that when it exited the reservoir, it had much more force. And you can see by 1855, and this is only, 10 years after it was, 12 years after it was completed, you can see how thoroughly built up the neighborhood has become. And that's all new. And it's all due to the aqueduct, just about. Just beside the distributing reservoir was something called the Crystal Palace. That went up in 1850. It was part of an industrial technology exposition that was held in 1850 in New York City. It was where Elisha Otis demonstrated his braking mechanism on an elevator, and lots of other sort of basic innovations were displayed. So that's what was originally beside it. Of course, this now is Bryant Park, the area behind the former distributing reservoir. Here's the Schwartzman building, the New York Public Library, and here's a photo of the distributing reservoir with Fifth Avenue back in the day. Okay, I think this is dates to 02 through 07, so they're already dismantling it. It was built, as I said, by a professional architect. I have a feeling Jervis did not like this guy very much at all. Jervis was an intensely practical man. I'm very interested in finding out about their relationship. But Renwick was really the premier architect of his day. He designed St. Patrick's Cathedral, the Smithsonian. The resume is ridiculous. He was also a very good friend of Washington Irving's. And he and Irving bought a big piece of land in Hastings on Hudson. And they bought it from a guy called Peter Post. If you know anything about Hastings, that's our Revolutionary War, guy. He's our figure from the Revolutionary War. And that's who they bought from. Unfortunately, he only held on to that piece of land for a couple of years. But yes, he was in Hastings. The ultimate model for his distributing reservoir is something like this, an ancient Egyptian temple, okay? This is called, art historians call this a pylon. It's a feature that tapers slightly as it goes up, and it's crowned by a papyrus cornice, which is this flaring cornice that comes out. This is ultimately what Renwick is imitating. Very high-minded, very sophisticated, very not Jervis. So I'm interested in how they got along. It was built on a cemetery. So we're going back 2 levels now. Okay, we're going from the New York Public Library to the reservoir to the cemetery, which was under it. And the cemetery, let me look at my notes. The cemetery was known as a city burying ground. It's actually quite mysterious. Disturbing cemeteries was nothing new for the aqueduct builders. They did so in Seneca Village. They did so in a couple of locations in Westchester. And so this was nothing new. And it was already owned by the city, so they didn't have to go to the trouble of buying it from somebody. It's very mysterious. Very little is written about this cemetery. I could not find much about it. I know that it was completed in 1824, and it was meant to be, at least in part, a potter's field. That's a place for the burial of unclaimed bodies and convicts, and people too poor to pay for a private burial would go into a potter's field. And so that's what this was meant to be, at least in part. It was opened, or it was created after the closure of the Washington Square Potter's Field. Those of you who like to hang out in Washington Square Park, that was a cemetery for a very long time. It was a potter's field. So after that one was closed, they opened this one. And the Washington Square Potter's Field, that was just one of many cemeteries that were getting punted uptown at this point to ahead of the advancing city. They were trying to get all the cemeteries out of the city. And so we have this. In the literature of the time, the city tried to build the cemetery as a potter's field, but also as a place to bury people of middling means if they had the money. And so part of it had lavish vaults with willow trees planted around them. They also promoted it, progressively enough, as a cemetery for people of all faiths. So this is a little racy for 1825. After being closed to make way for the new reservoir, the exhumed bodies were sent on quite a journey. They moved first to 50th Street to another cemetery, and then to Ward's Island in 1857, and finally to Hart's Island, which is the current site of the New York City Potter's Field. I've read conflicting things about how many people were actually buried in this cemetery. Some people say that there were thousands of people. Some say that there were almost no people in this cemetery. It's just something else I'm working on at the moment. There are certainly reasons why New Yorkers might not have wanted to be buried in this cemetery. This progressive idea of all faiths and being in one cemetery and being Potter's Field. I mean, you could be buried next to a convict, or even worse, a Catholic. No good. So I imagine this put off a lot of New Yorkers. It was also a time when body snatchers were on the prowl, very much on the prowl. And because the remote location of this cemetery would have made it very attractive to them, stealing bodies for medical research. What time? How's my time? Oh, really? All right, so let's jump to, we want to leave time for questions, I guess, right? I think you're all right. Keep going. Okay. Well, I guess, all right, what I wanted to say very quickly before we left the New York Public Library is that if you go into the basement of the New York Public Library, a lot of people are going to tell you that a couple of exposed walls down in the basement belong to the reservoir. And it's not true. I spent way too much time on this, because I wanted them so badly to be part of the reservoir. But what they appear to be are basically the stones that were used in the reservoir reused in new foundations. The reason, and they look exactly like the ones in the Central Park retaining wall. It's the same mixture of roughly shaped blocks with smaller stones and so on. It's definitely the same stones. They've just been reused. And the reason I know that is because they're in the wrong spot. The rebuilt walls go like this. The only wall that they could potentially be part of is this huge central wall that separated the reservoir into two compartments. That wall ran like this, and the two walls are located here and here. They're in the wrong spot. It's too bad. I really wanted them to be part of the reservoir. So to conclude, the water entered this a distribution network that distributed it to Lower Manhattan. It consisted basically of private connections for individual homes and other structures, and also public outdoor hydrants at intersections. There was a yearly fee of between $10 and $12 for anyone wanting a private connection. If you wanted a private connection for your house, you paid $12 a year, which basically meant that only the well-heeled could have water in their home. The poor had to content themselves with the outdoor hydrants for the most part. There was a proposition, and so most of the early pipes were built in the wealthy neighborhoods because the aqueduct board was so keen to make its money back. It had spent $12 million on the aqueduct, and so it wanted people to pay for their water, and the only people that could were the rich, and so they built the pipe network in the rich neighborhoods first. And eventually they put hydrants in the poor neighborhoods as well. There was a proposal at one point to pay for the aqueduct with a general tax, not from fees from rich people, but a general tax, so that anyone who wanted it could have a direct tap to their home. But this was knocked down. The powers that be decided that was actually unfair, because the reasoning was that if everybody got a tap, then the factories and the big businesses would be using so much more water than everybody else that they'd basically be getting a public subsidy. Okay, and so we should keep it the way it is. We should get our revenue from people paying annual rents. So that's basically my talk, everybody. I know it's an odyssey. We're going through the entire island, but that's what I've got so far. It's kind of a preliminary talk. This really needs to be developed quite a bit. But these are my preliminary findings. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you.
All right, well, if anybody has any questions online as well, type them into the chat. If anyone in here has questions, I can bring you a microphone. So have at it.
Laura.
So this map that we're looking at right now, the map with the stop box.
Right.
It looks like, when I look at this map, it looks like these I'm guessing it's like a water pump of some sort. They look.
Oh, the little dots?
Yeah.
Oh, those represent stopcocks. They're just valves that just stop the water from flowing backward.
So that's where you would tap in to that point and bring a line into a structure.
Right. So all of these lines that you see right now are running under streets.
Okay.
And so the houses all along those streets had the option of running a private line into the water main, just like we have it now.
So all you had to do was pay $12 a year.
Well, you also had to pay for all the plumbing.
Okay.
You had to pay for the connection. And indoor toilets, indoor sinks, all of that stuff, with taps were a new thing. So plumbers charged a lot to have all those fixtures. But of course, the rich wanted it because what a status symbol,
Okay. So then what, do we know what is the physical access to the water look like at this point? Do we know that? Do we have like a clear sense of like how accessible water was in different places? Or is that sort of like a level of detail that is not yet available?
Do you mean the hydrants?
Yeah, like how did people get the water?
They were at intersections, and supposedly they were every 3 blocks.
Every 3 blocks?
Yeah. Which
Okay.
meant a lot of people would be walking multiple blocks and carrying extremely heavy buckets, probably children.
Yeah, wow.
So, but at least they wouldn't get cholera, you know? The water was good. And the water board presented it as this very magnanimous, socially responsible thing that they were doing, providing the poor with hydrants and so on. So I don't know. I don't know when people of middling means or, and the poor, by the way, would not be paying for the connections themselves. Their landlords would be paying for the connections. So really, it would be up to the landlord. And from what I've read about landlords in this era, they probably weren't interested in providing their tenants with a private connection to the Croton water.
Okay. Thank you.
Unfortunately.
Thank you. This is important information. I appreciate
Thank
it.
Yeah, John.
So you say that the hydrants are installed for the poor.
Right.
Prior to that, what would have been the means of the poor acquiring water? Are they going to wells, and how does that work?
Some of them actually were still using the collect pond, which was the original sort of main water source for colonial New York. But by the 1830s, the collect pond had become thoroughly contaminated. There were tanners working alongside it and butchers, and they were throwing carcasses into the collect pond. And tanning is a filthy, very toxic business, and they were throwing all of their byproducts into the collect pond. So that was apparently it had the color of like tomato juice. And then they were using wells, but the wells oftentimes were located beside outhouses, and so you had contaminated feces in the water.
And then we just have one more question online.
Yeah.
Do any of these underground water lines still exist today, or have they all been replaced?
That is, I can't wait to figure that out. I don't know. That is on my list of things that I really want to find out. Not only do I want to find out, what instances of this original network survive. I want to know how many parts of the conduit survive. I suspect there's quite a bit under 10th Avenue. I suspect there's a stretch in Central Park, but I have yet to confirm all that.
One more.
Do we know anything about what the pipes were made out of? There's a lot of focus right now on lead pipes. Did
Yeah.
we replace cholera with lead poisoning? Or
Yes.
Yes.
Initially. By 1850, they realized that lead was poisonous, and so they had to replace everything. They had to replace everything that they had installed up to that point. Although, luckily for them, the Croton water actually was not popular at first. People didn't buy. They thought it was dirty. They thought that. There were a lot of people. The aqueduct was built by Irishmen, and people were saying that the Irish were, doing things with the water and whatever that made it unhealthy. We can't underestimate the extent of anti-Irish sentiment. So the fact that it was made by Irish hands actually made it unappealing to a lot of people. But, yeah.
I've never heard that before.
It's true.
I believe it.
Yep. So the other thing was they didn't want to pay for it. They thought it was too expensive. It wasn't until there was yet another cholera outbreak in, I think it was 1845 or 1849, and yet another massive fire that people finally started to buy it. And when they started to buy it, it was a very quick process, to the point that By the end of like 1851, the supply was completely maxed out. And they were already starting to build an extra reservoir, a larger pipe, and ultimately more aqueducts. So that was a lot of complex information, guys. If you were like in my class, you know, I'd be like, congratulations, you know, thanks for sticking with me. You know, that was a lot. So I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for doing this for us, Keith. This was very interesting, and you know, I know now I'll get you a headlamp for your urban spelunking adventures, looking for those lines. But
The DEP would not appreciate that.
I will just let everybody know that's stuck with us that on January 1st we have our first day hike coming up.
Oh, yes.
And that is going to be led by Mr. or Dr. Keith Doherty here. Join
you.
us. Yeah, but I'm the man behind the curtain. We don't have to pay attention to me right now. On Wednesday, January 14th, we're going to be joined online by Frederica Bear, who you may have seen in the Ken Burns documentary, giving a lecture on Fort Kniphausen and other mishmash Hessians in Westchester County during the American Revolution. So we're all really looking forward to that. Again, that's Wednesday, January 14th, and that is going to be free online. So thanks for joining us, everyone, and have a good night.
All right. Thank you.